At the end of World War II, the world held the Nuremberg trials. Nazi doctors who had conducted experiments on human beings were tried, convicted, and in several cases executed. The message was clear. There were lines that could not be crossed, and those who crossed them would face justice. But in the Pacific, a different decision was made. Japan had its own program of human experimentation, one that operated for over a decade, involved thousands of victims, and produced data on biological and chemical weapons that no ethical laboratory could ever have generated. When American investigators discovered what had happened, they made a choice. They buried it in exchange for the data. This is the story of Unit 731. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. It operated primarily in Pingfang, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a vast secret complex that at its height employed over 3,000 personnel. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its actual purpose was the development of biological and chemical weapons tested on live human subjects. The unit was established in 1935 under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a military doctor who had become convinced that biological warfare was the future of modern conflict and that the only way to develop effective weapons was to test them on human beings. The subjects, referred to internally as maruta, the Japanese word for logs, were primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Some were Soviet, some were Korean, some were Allied prisoners. None of them consented. None of them survived the experiments. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 were among the most extreme acts of medical violence in recorded history. Subjects were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax to study how the diseases progressed, how quickly they killed, and how they might be weaponized for delivery on enemy populations. Vivisections were performed on living subjects without anesthesia. Organs were removed while subjects were conscious so that researchers could observe their function in real time without the distortion of chemical agents. Subjects were exposed to extreme cold, limbs frozen and then thawed repeatedly, to study frostbite and test potential treatments for Japanese soldiers in Manchurian winters. Pressure chambers were used to study the effects of atmospheric pressure on the human body. Subjects were placed inside until their eyes ruptured or until organs prolapsed. Subjects were spun in centrifuges until they died. Others were subjected to lethal doses of X-ray radiation. Some were burned with flamethrowers. Some were used to test the effective range of grenades and explosive devices. Biological weapons were tested in the field as well. Plague-infected fleas dropped from aircraft over Chinese cities. Cholera and typhoid introduced into water supplies. Entire communities used as outdoor test populations. The estimated number of people killed directly by Unit 731 ranges from 3,000 to over 10,000. The number killed by field tests on civilian populations is unknown and likely far higher. When American forces entered Japan in 1945, they quickly became aware that something significant had taken place in Manchuria. Shiro Ishii had ordered the destruction of the Pingfang facility before the Soviet advance reached it. Buildings were demolished, records were burned, and surviving test subjects were killed to eliminate witnesses. Ishii himself went into hiding. But enough survived, documents, testimony, witnesses, for American investigators to piece together what Unit 731 had done. The lead investigator was Brigadier General Charles Willoughby, Chief of Intelligence for General Douglas MacArthur. His conclusion, passed up the chain of command to Washington, was stark. The data generated by Unit 731 was of significant military value. It could not be obtained by any ethical means, and the Soviet Union was also investigating, meaning if the United States didn't act quickly, Moscow would get to it first. The recommendation: grant immunity to the researchers in exchange for full disclosure of their findings. Washington approved. In 1948, the United States government quietly granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to Shiro Ishii and the key researchers of Unit 731. The agreement was simple. The researchers would hand over all of their data, experimental results, biological weapons specifications, field test outcomes, and in return they would face no consequences whatsoever for what they had done. The deal was kept secret. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the Pacific equivalent of Nuremberg, no member of Unit 731 was prosecuted. The United States had the evidence. The United States chose not to present it. The Soviet Union, which had captured some Unit 731 personnel in Manchuria, did prosecute in the Khabarovsk war crimes trial of 1949. 12 Japanese officers were convicted and sentenced. The American response was to publicly dismiss the Soviet trial as propaganda. The data, the biological weapons research purchased with immunity, was transferred to Fort Detrick in Maryland, the center of the U.S. biological weapons program. It was classified. It informed American biological weapons development through the Cold War. Shiro Ishii returned to civilian life in Japan. He opened a medical clinic. He died in 1959 of throat cancer. No charges were ever filed. The existence of Unit 731 was not officially acknowledged by Japan until 1997. For over 50 years, the program was absent from Japanese history textbooks. Veterans were instructed not to speak of it. The government maintained official silence. In the United States, the classified files on Unit 731 remained sealed for decades. When researchers began requesting documents under the Freedom of Information Act in the 1980s, they were told records either didn't exist or couldn't be released. It was not until the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 and a parallel push by researchers and journalists that the scale of the American deal with Unit 731 became fully documented. What those documents confirmed, the United States government had known from 1945 onward exactly what Unit 731 had done. It had made a deliberate choice to grant immunity. It had actively suppressed the evidence at Tokyo, and it had used the data, purchased with that immunity, to advance its own weapons programs. The victims, Chinese, Soviet, Korean, Allied, received no acknowledgement, no reparations, no justice. The Japanese government has never formally apologized for Unit 731. The American government has never formally acknowledged the immunity deal. And the data obtained from those experiments, data generated by the deaths of thousands of people, was quietly folded into the architecture of Cold War military research. This has been the suppressed history they didn't want you to find. New documentary next week.